Chapter 2 of History of Japan in Words of One Syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Smithies. History of Japan in Words of One Syllable by Helen Ainslie Smith. Chapter 2. How the Mikado's empire became a real nation. From the first, the Mikados have had the right to name whom they choose to take the throne when they should die or have to leave it. And though, as a rule, it goes to the first son, the son has to wait for his sire to name him or to abide by his will if he thinks best to name one of his brothers. Jemu left his throne to one of his 3 sons when he died. He, in turn, left it to one of his sons, and so it was with a long line of whom we do not know much that is truth, though their names and some dates have been kept with great care in the list of the Mikados. And one of the first who wrote Japanese history tells long tales of their reigns and great deeds. Most of them were more than 100 years old when they died, and one of them is said to have been on the throne for 101 years. All of the 8 kings who sat on the throne in the years that passed from the time of Jemu till the date when Christ was born in the lands of the West, which was not thought of nor heard of in Japan, the chief Mikado of note was Shujin, whose reign was for more than half the century that came to an end with the birth of Christ. He was both brave and good, and gave much thought to the gods, we are told, and by him the rough tribes of the Isles were made much more like a real nation than they had been ere this. Up to this time, the Japanese were but a half-wild host, made up of folks from most all the lands near them. They were rude and strong, fond of sports, and in all ways much like the tribes of the East of those old times. But they left off their wild and rough ways more soon than most of them. To win in war made a man great, and gave him strength and force with those who knew him. This Shujin had done in the days of his youth, and so he was the more able to lift his folks up when he came to be Mikado, for they felt that they could trust him to lead them. It was due to his zeal that the old faith of the realm, which had come with Jemu, was kept up, for folks had grown not to think of their gods by this time. But this prince made much of the rites and all that was due to the faith of his sires, and he built it up so strong that from that time to this it has kept a great hold on the Japanese. The folks had grown into some wrong ways since the days of Jemu. They did not think of their gods, and some of them did not try to do right, nor to please those who dwelt in the sky and had sent down Jemu in his race to live in and rule Japan. This gave the good Shujin much grief. He sent calls to the folks to give up their bad ways and be good, but they did not heed him, till a great plague came, which, the Japanese say, the gods would not check till the king made long fasts and prayed much to them, and had a great rite in view of all the world, that is, Japan, for in old times the Japanese thought their realm was the whole earth. When the plague did stop, which must have been when it could spread no more, or at a change in the weather, the folks were much struck with the signs of how great were their gods and their own sins, and they then took heed of the Mikado's call and sought to do the will of the gods with great zeal. By this means, Shu Jin soon did a great deal to raise the realm from the rough state in which he had found it to peace, good rule, and all the fine things for a realm which are meant by the one big word, civilization. There were in the house of the Mikado a mirror, a sword, and a ball, which Jemu had put there with much care as the sacred emblems of his god race, that is, things which the Mikado and all the men of the land were to look on as the type of what was most high to them, somewhat as Roman Catholics look on the cross. These Shu Jin sent out of his house for fear it was not well for them to be so near him, for his body was but of earth, though his soul was of heaven. And while he had a mirror, a sword, and a ball made, just like them, and put in a place of reverence, made for them in his own house, the real emblems were put in a small church built for them far off from the house of any man, where they could not be hurt in the least by aught that was not pure. Then he made his own girl child a priestess to take care of them, and to this day these things are in the shrines of Uji and Ec, where they were put in the year 4 AD. They are still kept in the charge of a maid who is of the race of the Mikado and cannot wed. The small church or temple which the Mikado built for the copies of the emblems was the first of the shrines that have since been put up as part of each royal house that has been raised in Japan. Shu Jin's zeal for the good of the realm came out in more than one way. He did as much for its trade, its growth in wealth and strength as a state, as for the true faith. He made a law that all men and women of the realm should, each for a short time, leave their own work and give a share of their toil to the realm. The work of the men went for the troops, while that of the women was at their looms or in the field. This wise king did a great deal to put new ways of life in the place of the old ones the men had learned from their sires of the half-wild tribes of Asia. To make a just plan for them to pay their tax, he had the first lists made out of the folks in all parts of the land, which was the same scheme as that by which a census, as we call it, is made in our own land each 10 years or so. And he taught them, too, how to keep account of time. For Shu Jin to think this out for himself shows that he was a man of a great mind. He had boats built too, and did all he could to try to make the folks work more and do more, to take more in their boatloads when they set out with fish or the stuff that they had made or raised in their fields, to other ports to change for things they could not raise. In this way they built up trade, and their wealth grew year by year as time went on. Then he taught them to make more of their land than they had known how to ere this, so that he is now known as the father of Japanese farming. He made canals himself and sent forth word that his folks should dig them too, so that the fields of rice need not want for water. This made the rice crops more large than they had been, but there were more boats to bear it to parts of the realm where it did not grow, and in this way the men of the north and south, east and west, came to deal with and to know each other. This kept them so that they did not grow not to care for any part of the realm but just that where they dwelt, which does a realm great harm. You can see by this that the rice trade of Japan is an old one as well as a large one. There are vast fields of flat lands with huge tanks full of water to be let out on the field when the right time comes, for rice is grown as well as sown in water. And the hillsides, too, are sometimes cut so as to form stages like great flights of steps, and more than one swift stream is turned from its wild course to flow smooth and calm through a long ditch cut through the rice fields of the hillsides. There was naught, it seems, that this good Mikado did not think of for his realm. Home work, home trade, good laws were not all that he left his folks. He made friends with Korea, and let one of the great chiefs of that realm of the West come across the sea of Japan and live on his lands. And he learnt from his guest good things which he made use of in his realm. As there were yet in the north part of the isles some wild tribes of the Ainos, or the first men of the land, who still held out as foes of the Japanese, and with whom these good farm folks of Yamato were in a sort of line war all the time, Shujin made up his mind to put the whole realm in charge of troops to guard its bounds and to keep its men and their homes safe from the foe. The whole land was marked off into 4 parts, and each part was put in the charge of a chief man-at-arms, which the Japanese call a shogun, and which we would call a general. This was the first stage of the Mikado's troop, which grew great as years went on, and which came at last to claim a large class from the Japanese race. But at first the ranks were made up from the hands in the field, the tradesmen, and from all the folks who left their work and went out to fight under the Mikado themselves, when there was a call to war, and who took their way back home as soon as it was done. It was in the reign of the next king that storehouses were set up in the realm, and that some such plans as those for the troops of our own day were made to keep food and arms on hand, so that the men could set out at any time to put down an outbreak of their foes, or quell any such ill in their own lands. For some of the Mikado's own men were not yet much less rough and wild than those of the tribes from which they had sprung. In the far-off parts of the realm there had to be a strict watch kept on them all the time, or they would rise in host and break out in much the same sort of fights as we still have to dread from our red men of the West. Someone who has dwelt in Japan and knows its tale well says that the Mikado's realm grew by war and fire and bloodshed, very much as our own race first got its hold on the land of the red men. The Japanese were warlike men from the first, and it was in the camps and field near the lines of their wild foes that their race of men-at-arms grew and learnt to love war and to live for naught but that, and to know all its arts and have so much more skill in them than the sons of other parts of the East. It was this army plan, too, which did a great deal to bind all the parts of the realm into one empire, so that it grew in strength as it grew in size, which it could not have done if it had been cut up in parts that spent their life in home wars. End of chapter 2.